welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9, and will also be available on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube station at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and this morning I am delighted to welcome Jeffrey Richmond-Moll. He's the George Putnam Curator of American Art at the Peabody Essex Museum, and he's here to talk about a wonderful exhibit called Making History, 200 Years of American Art. So, Jeff, first of all, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to be here to talk to us about the exhibit.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure, absolutely. I hope that we can get started with you just telling us a bit in general about the range of artists whose works are exhibited in this show, the time span that the exhibition covers, and its co-organizer, which is the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, familiarly known as PAFA.
That's right. So this is an exhibition, as the title suggests, 200 Years of American Art, from around the time of independence in the 1770s until the 1970s. And the exhibition is drawn entirely from the collection of PAFA, the Pennsylvania Academy, which is the nation's first museum and school of art, founded in 1805. And so over its 2+ centuries, it has built an incredible collection of American painting and sculpture. So we are showing 85 works from PAFA's collection, familiar names like Edward Hopper, Winslow Homer, Mary Cassatt, Georgia O'Keefe, and then names that might not be as familiar, including some that were surprises to me, but really a wonderfully rich array of landscapes, portraits, genre scenes, still lifes, and on and on. But PAFA organized this exhibition several years ago, and it's been traveling the country for the last year and a half, and we are one of the venues of that tour.
And I'm very glad that you were, because I really enjoyed the exhibit. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about PAFA. They have a long and distinguished history, and certain aspects of their mission overlap with those of the Peabody Essex Museum. So I hope you could talk a little bit about PAFA's legacy, including how their admissions policies made history, and how that development connects with this particular exhibition.
Sure. So as I said, PAFA was founded in 1805 by two artists, Charles Willson Peale, who was a painter and many other things. He had a museum on the second floor of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, in addition to his work with PAFA, and William Rush, a sculptor. And they were hoping to form a place for the professionalization of American artists. Oftentimes, American artists had to travel abroad to pursue a professional career, to pursue training, because those institutions didn't really exist in the United States. And they were hoping to create this sort of homegrown American artistic culture, as well as a home to display fine art to a wider public. And so it's kind of around this time of the founding of the United States, several decades after independence, as PAFA and then institutions like the East Indian Marine Society, which is PEM's predecessor, founded in 1799, were thinking about the role of public spaces for experiencing art and culture, creating a kind of discerning citizenry in this new democratic republic where, it sort of depended on an educated public to help run a nation, but also to feel connected to a wider sort of human story and global culture. And I think those latter pieces, the sort of the role of human creativity and the place of the U.S. in a global culture, both of those were at the heart of the founding of PAFA and the Peabody Essex Museum as it existed in the early 1800s.
And do I remember correctly that PAFA was the first to admit women and African Americans to study art?
That's right. Yeah, PAFA has a really progressive history in its education of artists. And this is, you're sort of talking about both its role as an academy and a museum. they admitted women for study fairly early on, around the 1840s, 1850s, and admitted African American students as well. They're among the earliest institutions in training fine artists to do so in both those cases, and really fostered communities for women artists and African American artists to develop their artistic skills, forge professional networks, connect to wider audiences. I mean, this was a crucial part of PAFA's story.
Yeah, and just proving that making art is making history, because they made history with that policy change as well. And I found, Jeff, that the exhibition does a fascinating job of connecting making history with making art, highlighting the way that artists both craft and retell the nation's history, but sometimes in ways that remake history, sometimes burnishing a narrative, and at other times drawing our attention to grittier truths about our reality and our history that we might otherwise prefer to ignore. And to me, two of the most striking examples of this in the exhibit were Benjamin West's very large, imposing canvas that starts the exhibit off, if I remember correctly, Penn's Treaty with the Indians, which dates from 1771 to 2, and then a much later painting from 1933, Alice Neal's Investigation of Poverty at the Russell Sage Foundation. And we can show these images while we talk. Could you, Jeff, talk about the impetus behind and the contrast between the ways that each of these two very different paintings aims to make history?
Sure. Well, so West Penn's Treaty with the Indians really takes on a kind of mythic status quite quickly in American culture as the scene of a kind of a founding moment in American history, as William Penn and fellow European settlers are negotiating this treaty with the Lenape peoples of the Delaware River area. They're under this elm tree, which becomes another symbol of the kind of peaceful coexistence of European colonists and indigenous peoples. And it becomes this kind of picture of a harmonious transfer of land, of a harmonious kind of coexistence. And that treaty, in some ways, there was something quite peaceful, and the interactions that Penn had with the Lenape peoples were generally positive, but over time, it's Penn's descendants who start to really mess things up. I mean, they take advantage of aspects of these early treaties. They exploit loopholes. And the public starts to become aware of this by the 1770s, when Penn's descendants, the Penn family, are facing real kind of political and economic crises that a painting like Benjamin West's is aiming to sort of cover over in a way. That the painting depicts a treaty that we look at it today and we say, oh, this is a document of a historical event. And it was painted over 90 years after the scene that's unfolding. And so there's a remove of almost a century, and there's also a sort of PR campaign happening here where Penn's descendants are saying, here is this ancestor we can look back to who can repair our public image. So there's something kind of nefarious happening there, as you said, kind of burnishing or remaking history to our own purposes in the present day, versus Alice Neal's painting, which is painted in 1933 at the height of the Depression. The Russell Sage Foundation, Alice Neal had very strong opinions about organizations like these, who she felt only had an interest in the poor in an abstract sense. How can we understand the forces at play that are causing poverty in this country? But never interested, as Neal emphasized, in actually helping the impoverished, in aiding and uplifting the marginalized. And it's this gathering of individuals in a room, almost like an inquisition, around a table with this woman who's burying her face in her hands, likely in tears. Neil said it was a woman found living under an overturned car with 7 children. Neil is painting, unlike West, history unfolding in the present.
Yeah.
And so this is, not to throw West under the bus necessarily, but to say that Neil is concerned with painting history unfolding in the present day. How do you capture history in the making, in the present tense? And I think that's the ambition of Neil's picture. And I think really the role of artists, as the exhibition emphasizes, in creating and sort of framing our relationship with our past and our collective present.
They make a stunning contrast, Jeff, as you've described, and also a real testimony to the power of making art impacting how we understand history. So that was one of the things I enjoyed the most about the exhibition, the powerful contrast that the paintings juxtaposed with one another made in our understanding of the power of art. And that brings us to another theme of the exhibition, which is the question that's posed: how and why does representation matter? And artists in the exhibit are shown answering this question in many different ways, from the 1700s and the 1800s, when artists often portrayed individuals of wealth and power, while there's a shift in the portraits shown dating from later in the 1800s and 1900s to a much broader definition of who merits representation in an art gallery, shaped in part, I think, by the entry of more diverse artists, such as women and African American artists, thank you, PAFA, into art schools, thereby giving them greater access to the public. And to me, these differing choices gave the exhibition some of the most illuminating and also very enjoyable contrasts. So, for example, starting with the Gilbert Stuart's 1796 portrait of George Washington, which was so interesting to me because you see Washington in nice but regular black clothing, but he's posed in front of what looks like a kind of classical background with draping and columns, and that was intriguing to me. What message is Gilbert Stuart trying to get across by posing Washington in this way with this kind of background?
Well, I think Gilbert Stuart's painting is another great example of the role of artists in shaping our collective understanding of American identity. I mean, the face of Washington that he paints becomes the face on our dollar bill.
Yeah.
And so, even in his own time, Stuart is creating this sort of iconic representation of Washington the man, but also Washington the politician, and therefore, what a president looks like, because there is no visual vocabulary. There's no sort of set of symbols necessarily for what a leader of a democratic republic looks like. America has just declared independence from Great Britain. They know what kings look like. They don't want Washington to look like a king, but they need him to look like a head of state. They need him to look like a commander-in-chief and a diplomat and all these other things. And so what Stuart does in this great portrait, the standing portrait of Washington, is kind of layer in these different features that together say something about what it means to represent within a single person the leader of this new nation. So you said he's dressed in all black. He's wearing gentleman's clothes. He's not wearing the robes of an aristocrat or a king. But he has a gentleman's sword at his side, which is maybe also a slight reference to his military service. He's got a desk full of letters, and so he's engaged in exchange and negotiation. And that column and curtain in the background, those are a hallmark of paintings of leaders of state, the sort of the head of state portrait. You look at the European tradition of painting, and those are always there, but another individual is standing in front of it. So this is what Stuart's trying to do, is to say, here's what a leader of this new country looks like, and you can see the lasting power of that likeness for how we continue to understand both the sort of political system of our country, but also its wider identity.
another perfect example of making art, making history, because as you point out, we see that image every time we look at a dollar bill. So anyway, thank you. That was really fascinating, Jeff. I appreciate that. Right next to George Washington, then, in a very striking contrast, is an equally large, very colorful portrait dating from 1919 of a vaudeville performer, Ruth St. Denis in the Peacock Dance, painted by Robert, is it Henry or Henri?
That's Henry, actually.
Henry. I would never have gotten there. Thank you. So this is such a striking contrast. Could you talk about what has changed in the norms of portraiture that this contrast reveals?
Yeah, well, so Robert Henry paints this portrait of Ruth St. Denis, who's this, today we recognize as a really pivotal figure in the history of modern dance. And 1919 is the year that she premieres this Peacock Dance. And she's, as you said, she's dressed in this incredible costume that has these features like the plumes of a peacock. And Henry recognized the power of this painting and of this dancer herself when he said that this painting was a mighty propaganda. Those were his words. So he's recognizing the power of representing a single individual and its impact on a culture. But what we also see, especially in the contrast between Washington's portrait by Stuart and Ruth St. Denis' portrait by Henry, is a larger shift in American culture that's happening around the turn of the 20th century as cities are growing, as people are sort of gathering, think Edward Hopper. You have an example of this in the show, but kind of the isolation of the American city and the need in this sort of new era for your outward appearance to say something about yourself. Whereas for the previous century and more, it was your inward character and your inward virtue that was something you were trying to sort of build up, and that was noble, was one's character, which was internal, unseen in certain ways. The 20th century becomes this moment when your outward personality is emphasized, and because you had to be seen in a crowd, you had to. And so what we see with a portrait like Henry's is that shift happening, but also I think the power of women now coming onto a public stage, and we set the Washington portrait alongside the Ruth St. Denis to kind of say, what are our expectations of histories of portraiture more generally? A kind of painting, a kind of history of representation that often privileges, as you said, the wealthy, the male, and how does a painting like Henry's upset the kind of privileges that we give to certain individuals in our history? So yeah, it's such a fun, striking contrast, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Oh, totally fun, and it struck me also as perhaps maybe the emergence of, I guess we might use the phrase, the celebrity culture, as being an entertainer, actually meriting fame and interest. Besides that peacock costume, I mean, come on, that's pretty great, and very much attention-getting. And certainly attention-getting is, in our current culture, very much what makes someone a celebrity. People can be famous for being famous today, and it struck me as I was walking by it and looking at what Washington was famous for and what this other portrait with the peacock outfit was famous for. It just struck me as, we're seeing the emergence here, perhaps, of a very different way of what makes a person worthy of our interest, or to use the phrasing of the exhibition, meriting representation. And you put it, that was really interesting to me, the way you put it about in previous times, the importance of character, or something inward, something not necessarily visible, except through their behavior, whereas something emerging later on that's more outward by design, because it captivates our attention. So thank you for that. That was really interesting, Jeff. There's another contrast that shows up in a very different kind of portrait. and I have to say this was one of my favorites, and that's Thomas Aiken's portrait of Walt Whitman, dating from 1887 to 1888. And I understand from the notes in the exhibition that this was Whitman's favorite portrait. And I think I can see why, but first, could you tell us what's striking to you about how Aiken chooses to represent the poet?
Well, Aiken's was a great portraitist, and Whitman was no stranger to having his portrait made. All the various editions of Leaves of Grass and his other publications often included on the sort of facing page to the title, the frontispiece, as we call it, an individual portrait of himself. And over the years, as the book was republished, you'd see Whitman himself age through his own portrait. So it's high praise from Whitman to say that Aiken's portrait was his favorite. There's a kind of warmth. You can sort of hear Whitman almost laughing to himself as you look at this picture. And there's Whitman is elderly at this point, long gray hair, long gray beard, but you can see a kind of lifetime of experience worn on his face. And Whitman as a kind of picture of a rugged individuality that becomes associated with American culture. I mean, this is, in spite of Whitman's age in the picture, this is what a young American nation tends to be associated with, is its youth, is its the sort of, as I said, the kind of individuality that comes to be associated with democracy and the kind of out of many one, right? As our motto, that we are a nation of individuals, and that is what makes us distinct. And so Whitman is kind of the consummate individual, and you see that in Aiken's picture.
Yeah, you talked about the warmth, and that really comes through, the warmth and the humanity and the accessibility of his. You feel like his personality is coming across to you. He kind of looks to me like he just tumbled out of bed, uncombed hair and the long beard. And as I said to you, it seemed appropriately Whitman, because it looked to me like, his hair and his beard contain multitudes, appropriately enough. So thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate that. There's another even starker contrast in another portrait that I was interested in, both the choice of subject and the style, and that's Barclay Hendrick's portrait titled JSB III, dating from 1968, much closer to our own era than other paintings that we've talked about. What can you tell us about the impact of this portrait?
Barclay Hendrick's another amazing portraitist who has ties to Philadelphia and studies at the Pennsylvania Academy. He is part of this group of African-American artists centered around Philadelphia in the 1960s. As the curator of the show, Anna Marley, says, there's this kind of perpetual revolutionary spirit to Philadelphia that I think is sometimes lost on people. But, the place where the Declaration is first drafted, signed, and read, and all the way into thinking about the Civil Rights era in the 1960s, the true spirit of this kind of Black political, intellectual, artistic culture happening, and Hendricks is capturing many of these individuals in his portraits who are artists, who are leaders of fashion and intellectual thought. His painting, JSB III, is a portrait of a fellow artist, James Brantley, who also studied at PAFA. And in one sense, it speaks to the key role of these kind of kinships of African-American artists in Philadelphia at this time, creating networks of mutual support. And in some ways, PAFA offered a place at a time when artists always did not have the kind of access to formal institutions of artistic training.
Yeah.
But JSB the third, this portrait of James Brantley, wearing these dark sunglasses with an afro, just a striking sort of black silhouette against a red background, and the kind of coolness of Brantley in this picture is also a stunning contrast, because in our show we have another painting by Brantley, his own self-portrait, done in the same year, painted in 1968, just after he's returned from the Vietnam War. And Brantley's a proud veteran, is still living today. And he spoke about what it meant to return from war at that time, both as an African-American veteran and a veteran more broadly, coming back from an unpopular war, to no fanfare in the dark of night. And yet he said in a radio interview after that time, he said, anything worth having is worth fighting for. And so I think you really see in Brantley's own self-portrait this kind of humility, but also this dedication of service and a self-certainty, a kind of self-possession that he portrays in one way, and that Hendricks shows that self-possession and confidence in a different but no less powerful way.
That self-portrait is, for me, was one of the most moving paintings in the exhibition. He is wrapped, as it describes in the notes, in a soiled American flag, and then you read about his experience returning from the Vietnam War as a veteran. And it's just very powerful, very moving. Worth a visit to the exhibition on its own. So thank you for that, Jeff. Well, another way that the exhibition makes history is by highlighting some of the challenges faced by women artists and African-American artists, and by introducing us to some of these artists that we might never have heard of or seen their works before. I was hoping that you could give us an example of some of the obstacles that women and African-American artists encountered during the time period of the exhibition and how they overcame them.
Sure. So, I mentioned that PAFA is one of the earliest fine art institutions to train women, but women students at PAFA still have to push and struggle for full access to all the resources of the academy and the kind of promises of artistic training it offered. They're admitted in 1844, initially only to a few classes, the kind of in the progression of study that traditional art academies followed, kind of the most foundational classes. It's not until the 1860s that they gain access to anatomy lectures, that PAFA would bring in a medical demonstrator, is what they were called. But it shows PAFA's connection to this wider medical community in Philadelphia. Thomas Aiken's great Gross Clinic, I think, is the clearest example of this connection between painting and medicine, as you have this surgery happening in a surgical amphitheater. It's a great picture, co-owned by PAFA and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, so not traveling in the show, unfortunately. But these anatomy lectures, which were key for artists to understand the anatomy of the human body in order to paint it. And so it's not until 1860, almost 15 plus years after they're first admitted, that they can even attend anatomy lectures, and not until the late 1860s that they can have their own life classes with a nude model posed in front of a classroom. They were held in not in mixed company, right?
Yeah.
So women had their own life class with a nude female model, because that was what was proper. But it took decades of assertion, of sort of activism from within the academy for women to gain access to this sort of full slate of possibilities that pursuing an artistic career could offer. What the show also indicates, with many women artists whose names might not be familiar to you, is that there are a number of women in the show who had to choose to leave behind their promising artistic careers. In several cases, because of their decision to take care of their family. And this, this is not the struggle between work and life, sort of pursuing one's professional ambitions and one's dedication to a family. That's a tension that's not behind us, certainly, but it's so much clearer to look in the 19th century at artists like Elizabeth Okey Paxton, for example, who was incredibly talented as an artist, could paint all manner of scenes, but she was married to an artist, and he wanted to be the one to paint figures. So she ended up painting still lifes. She kind of pulls back and compromises her own professional possibilities. The flip side of this is Lily Martin Spencer, who's sort of the exception to the rule. She's a mother of 13 children, and yet it's her husband who stays at home to take care of the children because she is such an incredibly successful painter, sells over 500 paintings during her lifetime, supports her family through her own income. And as I said, that's the rarity, unfortunately. So many women artists, including women artists not represented in this show in PAFA's collection or even PEMS or anywhere, had to face great obstacles, and oftentimes we don't know them today because the resources to pursue their career were unavailable, and so they just this question that visitors often ask me, how did I not know about this artist as we were walking through? It's like, well, there are a lot of reasons, but the system was working against them.
Yeah. The stories of those two women artists you just mentioned, they're right next to one another in the exhibition, and they're so striking. When I got to the one where she had 13 children, and her husband stayed home to take care of who is this guy? And I was hoping somebody should write a biography or probe that. How did that happen? But it's such an interesting juxtaposition, Jeff. I just kind of like my jaw dropped. So, well, I have to ask you about my favorite painting in the exhibition, and that was Winslow Homer's 1893 The Fox Hunt, which to me just evokes a kind of wonderful mystery. There's something appealing. There's no humans in it. It's your position to look out from behind a fox, which is tromping its way through fairly deep snow, and in front of it, you look out below. It must be kind of a ridge as the ocean waves in the background. And what I thought were black clouds initially turned out to be black crows hovering over it. But I felt as though I could feel the cold snow and the crisp air, and I almost felt as though I could hear the waves. So tell us, Jeff, what can you tell us about Homer's approach here to presenting a landscape?
Well, I think, important to acknowledge for Homer, first of all, in this kind of framing of a moment and of a scene and the kind of suspense that you talked about, is that Homer began his career as an illustrator. So he was familiar with, using a picture to not tell a full story necessarily, so that his pictures often don't provide closure. And this is something that audiences in his own time were a little bit let's say, frustrated with. They wanted to know, well, what happened? The Gulf Stream, which is a great painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with this man on a ship floating abandoned in the middle of the ocean, shark-infested waters. These old ladies write Winslow Homer and say, well, what happened to the man? Does he make it? And he writes back kind of annoyed, saying, oh, don't worry, he's going to be fine, even though it's a little tongue in cheek. But I think it's the same thing's happening here, that there's an uncertainty, there's this sort of lingering threat, more than lingering, imminent threat of these black crows swooping in over the fox as this predator who's now become prey. And it speaks to also Homer's experience later in life on the Maine coast. He settles at Prout's Neck, south of Portland, on family property, builds a studio where he can look out over the sort of snowy landscape that you're seeing in the picture, and comes later in his life really face to face with these elemental forces of nature, of the, you see in the background waves crashing against rock and this sort of clashing of the elements as that foam sprays up over the boulders in the background. And then this kind of elemental conflict of the crows and the fox, these little sprigs of berries that are off to the left that almost look like a foreshadowing of splattered blood on the snow. He's not subtle in certain ways, but this is part of his sort of coming face to face with the larger forces of nature and what it means to be a human in the face of a kind of vast universe. That is, this painting opens the final section on the tradition of painting the landscape in American art, and how landscapes sort of become a site to inquire about, our place as a country within a wider world, but also our place as people within a world of much larger forces that are, far larger than ourselves. And that's what the Homer painting is about too.
Well, in my mind, I know how that ends. The fox is fine. The crows go away. As Homer might have said if I'd written to ask him what happens, all is well.
But as another Homer scholar just said to me recently, the word for a flock of crows is a murder.
A murder, that's right.
And Homer was not unfamiliar with plays on words. So.
I'm sticking with my ending.
Okay.
Now, I know this may not be fair to ask you, and feel free to say so, but do you have a favorite?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I already talked about one, which is that James Brantley self-portrait.
Yeah.
I also loved, in terms of, I really actually started my professional career as a budding curator at PAFA.
Oh.
Coming out of college, I was an intern at the museum there, and so this is kind of this full circle moment of coming back to see works again that I already knew, but seeing them from a new position at the Peabody Essex Museum on the North Shore. And that in the final section of the show, we have this little sort of corner of works that are about the sea and about water, all of which have local connections. Mariana Sloane's Rocky Beach is probably one of my favorites, and she paints it in 1914 around the time she visits Rockport to see her brother John Sloane. Or John Twachtman, who dies in Gloucester in 1902, which I had no idea. And coming to Gloucester for the last 3 years of his life transforms his paintings. Milton Avery, Stuart Davis, both of them, the sea and the experience of the sea, particularly on the North Shore, had a transformative impact on their practice. And so to kind of come back to this collection that I knew so well, from the position of Salem, of New England, of this new place, helped me see works in the show in a new way, which is just really, hopefully visitors also feel that kind of sense of a connection to the place when they see the exhibition.
Well, that's a great story that you came full circle with starting out at PAFA and then having this exhibition come. You knew these paintings very well then, and that's a nice segue to the final question I have for you, which is that spending your curatorial life with American art and with this exhibition, I'm curious to find out your take on the overarching question that the exhibition poses, which is, are there qualities of style or substance that make an artist or an artwork distinctly American, Jeff?
Yeah, that's a question that I think the field of American art has been reckoning with for decades and decades, and it's a question that I think initially was rooted in this desire to say American art is unique and distinct, but distinct from mainly European art. What makes American art American was to say what makes it different from kind of this continuous almost inferiority complex of saying, we are unlike Europe, even though in so many ways European art has continued to influence the unfolding of American painting, sculpture, and so on. I think so the question of what makes something distinctly American is hard for me, because I think it also is a question of like what qualifies an artist or a work of art as American, which is a question I don't necessarily want to ask, because it also says that other people, certain individuals, can't qualify. And especially in the 21st century, I think that's just something we want to be careful about. But I think what makes a work honestly American is addressing and really embracing the contradictions of American culture, identity, and experience. And this is something that the exhibition tries to do in various ways, but to say that, in some ways the American story, the promises of the founding of the United States, it's still unfolding and still unresolved. And this section where Liberty Dwells of the exhibition, which tries to look at the ways that the founding freedoms of this country are lived out or not, in some cases, in everyday life. So, I look at a work like John Quincy Adam Ward's Freedman, which is a sculpture of this black man seated, but almost as if he's about to rise. And it's that inflection point of the scene, as he's sitting with arms across his lap, shackles around his wrists, but the chains have been broken. And so it empowers this individual in saying that he is an agent within his own freedom, his own liberation. And he's turned in a way that also, it's sort of a metaphor of a turning from a sort of dark past of trauma towards a hopeful future. But he's sitting in the middle of that transition from the one to the other. And I think American art that's honest sits in the middle of those things.
Yeah, that's extremely well put. I like that. It's like American art is always striving for, as we say, the ever more perfect union. It's never perfect. It is always striving toward the it has to become more perfect because of the contradictions that you just described. And in a lot of ways, where we began with the contrast between the pen and the treaty, that portrait, and the burnishing of American history, and the kind of raw confrontation with reality of the Alice Neal painting, that's what it's about. Between those two, the struggle we turn from one to the other, and we have to find our way. So thank you, Jeff. It's been so much fun and really fascinating to talk to you. I always feel very privileged when I have the opportunity to talk to a curator about an exhibit. And I should tell you, I go around telling people that I think that curators and reference librarians are the most intelligent people, and we should probably turn things over to all of you and let you make the more perfect union. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge and your wisdom.
Thank you. It was a pleasure and a privilege.
Oh, thank you. And we should add at the end that the exhibition is on through September 21st, so there's time left to go and see it. And if you want more information about it, you can always go to the PEM website, which is www.pem.org, and then just click on exhibitions and you'll find all the information that you need. Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, everybody, please be well. Farewell.